pleasure and honor to introduce our event speaker and chair. Nimai Mehta is presently Professorial Lecturer, Department of Mathematics and Statistics at the American University, Washington, D.C., in the U.S. He researches the quality and use of data under varying institutional contexts and is the lead coordinator of a multidisciplinary effort at the university to employ data science, economics, and machine learning to improve data on missing and exploited children. He was previously the principal investigator for a UNICEF project on the quality of education data and reforms in Myanmar. Professor Mehta has held teaching positions at the School of Economics, University of the Philippines, where he was a research fellow and program associate with the Center for Integrative and Development Studies. Prior positions include visiting scholar at the James M. Buchanan Center for Political Economy in Fairfax, Virginia, and adjunct professor at George Mason University, Department of Economics. He also serves on the Academic Council of the Indian School of Public Policy in New Delhi. Professor Mehta obtained a master's in applied economics from Bombay University and a doctorate in economics from the George Mason University in the US. Welcome, Professor Mehta.
Thank you, Shilpa. And let me start by thanking both Lewis and Dr. Kelkar for inviting me to share my some of the ideas that I've been working on with the PIC group today. I'm honored to be here with all of you.
Thank you. Um, Mr. Luis Miranda is chairman of the Center for Civil Society and Coro. He is a co-founder of the Indian School of Public Policy and Take Charge, a mentoring program for Catholic youth in Mumbai. He is also on the board of Educate Girls and SBI Foundation. Lewis is chairman of Manipal Cigna Health Insurance and senior advisor at Morgan Stanley. He is a trustee, University of Chicago Trust in India, and a member of the Global Leaders Group and the Advisory Council of the Ruston D Center for Social Sector Innovation at Chicago Board. Lewis has been involved in setting up two highly successful companies, HDFC Bank and IDFC Private Equity. Mr. Miranda blogs for Forbes, Thrive Global, and Spontaneous Order, and teaches at the Accelerated Development Program of Chicago Booth. He received an MBA from the Booth School of Business at the University of Chicago and is a member of the Institute of Chartered Accountants of India. Welcome, Mr. Miranda.
Thank you, Shilpa. And it's great to be here at PIC. Thanks for the invitation. Thank you, Dr. Kelkar, also for putting this together. And Nimai, glad to be in a conversation with you. We were actually going to talk about the domestic and global implications of the 2020 elections. But last week's bizarre attack on the US Capitol shocked many people across the world. So, Nimai, why don't you just tell us what happened in your city, Washington, D.C.?
So,
Uh,
may I
Okay,
please interrupt for
sure,
just
okay,
one
sure.
sure.
quick moment, and I'll hand the floor,
Okay, sorry.
hand charge to you, Lewis. I just want to make a couple of quick housekeeping announcements before we move on. I request our audience to please keep their microphones and videos turned off for the duration of the event, and please do send us your query via the Q&A box. We will, time permitting, address all of your questions to the extent possible. And now, without any further ado, let me call upon Mr. Miranda to start the proceedings. Over to you, Lewis.
Thanks,
Yeah.
Shilpa. Sorry about that. So, Nimai, tell us what happened in DC.
Happy to. So, but before I do that, Louis, let's step back and let's consider some factors that I think help us better understand or explain the events of January 6th. And there are two factors that I'd like to focus on. One is the cultural and political polarization that has been building up in the US for nearly a decade now. I believe it contributed to both the 2016 elections with the Trump victory and to the even larger number of votes Trump obtained in 2020. If you recall the election results, he obtained around 11 million more votes than he did in 2016. Now, I find this remarkable that given the period, the last 2 years that we've been, well, year and a half that we've been living through, is an extended nightmare with almost 400,000 deaths in the US due to the COVID pandemic, and with millions of jobs and livelihood that have been impacted. The fact that Trump came back with 74 million votes, I think that needs to be explained and understood. The second contributing factor that I'd like to focus on is what I call government failures. Now, I'm not referring to the usual ideological distinction that is made between markets versus the state. Instead, I mean a worsening over time of the capacity of various US government agencies, both at the local and the federal level, to successfully deliver their assumed mandates on governments or range of government services. And this has been going on for at least for the past 4 decades. There's a small example that I want to highlight that I came across recently on how New York City responded to the smallpox pandemic in I believe it was 1947. Um, and if you compare the rollout of the vaccination campaign in New York at that time, and you compare it with the what New York has achieved so far with the COVID vaccines, at that time, the public health officials managed to distribute at a rate that is 50 times uh, um, quicker than what New York has managed to distribute so far. So, as much as we'd like to pin the blame on Trump and his administration, and correctly so, for initially bungling up the response to the pandemic this last year and the continuing problems with the vaccine distribution, I think there's a longer term weakening that's been going on, and that continues to impact the functioning of the US government agencies. Now, if we come back to the Jan 6th event and use these two lenses of cultural polarization and government failures, I think things become clearer somewhat. So I put down a list of the decisions that the DC government agencies and law enforcement agencies made the week prior or leading the weeks leading up to the Jan 6th event. And there are 4 or 5 um, interesting decisions or remarkable decisions that have been made, and sort of gives you a sense of what I mean here by the endemic nature of government failure. One, the FBI, we are now told, received early warning reports about assorted groups and individuals that were planning to attack the US Capitol. And while it passed this intelligence to the local authorities, it failed to give it sufficient priority of getting the local agencies to treat it as actionable, quote unquote, actionable intelligence. Two, if you look at how the DC Mayor Muriel Bowser planned for the Jan 6th gathering of Trump supporters, she put down explicit instructions that the DC National Guard troops be deployed only for crowd management and for traffic direction and control, not for securing the US Capitol itself. 3 days prior to Jan 6th, the US Department of Defense offered twice to send in the National Guard to protect the US Capitol. And both times, the US Capitol Police turned down their offer. And four, in spite of all warning signs, the US Capitol Police thought it fit to only be prepared for what they considered to be a free speech demonstration. And now it seems that some of these rioters that are being invested currently were on the FBI terrorist list. So there were clearly warning signs here. In addition, if you take into account that from March to around August of last year, multiple state capitals have been the scene of multiple violent demonstrations and break ins by both the pro Trump, anti lockdown supporters and the Black Lives Matter protesters. Think it's remarkable that these DC government agencies and the FBI were unprepared for the Jan 6 demonstration and failed to see the high probability of violence that was likely to erupt. Coming to polarization, if you again look through their decisions, it seems that the ongoing polarization in the US seems to have biased decision making by these local officials. The mayor's office and the US Capitol Police were both unwilling to be seen as applying a heavy hand towards the protesters, given that they had criticized Trump for deploying the National Guard against the Black Lives Matter protesters last year in around July 2020. So I think when we consider these events, we need to be aware of the underlying factors in trying when we try and explain these events that have taken place. There's another striking historical example that I'd like to point to. I think that sort of gives you a better flavor of what I'm trying to drive here, make the point I'm trying to make here. On February 13th, 1861, a similar gathering of right wing rioters descended on the US Capitol, and they tried to stop the electoral vote count that would have declared Abraham Lincoln as the new president, elected president. And the Virginia mayor at that time, or rather, I'm sorry, the former Virginia governor, Henry Wise, was openly calling for an invasion of the US Capitol. But unlike what we saw on Jan 6th, there was a Southern born Army chief, Winfield Scott, who not only anticipated the problem, but he proactively deployed federal troops at the US Capitol, and he sent a blunt message to the rioters that they dare not come anywhere near the US Capitol. I've got a quote from what the warning he gave that you may find that has, I think, been it's sort of gone into the popular lore here. And Scott told the demonstrators that any man who attempted by force or unparliamentary disorder to obstruct or interfere with the lawful count would be lashed to the muzzle of a 12-pounder, a huge cannon, and fired out of the window of the Capitol. Now, that seems to have done the trick, and Lincoln, the electoral vote count went on smoothly, and Lincoln was declared to be the president. Of course, 3 months after that, the US entered the Civil War on April 1861. So I think we need to keep this history lesson in mind as we look forward to perhaps even the next week or the next few months or years. There is still, I think, the possibility of a serious domestic terrorist attack. Um, and I think, but I do think um, the law enforcement agencies at this point are better prepared for such a possibility.
Yeah, thanks, Nimai. And we've already got a question which is linked to what you said
Yeah.
from the audience. Basically, could the GOP party split into radicals and moderates as a result of what's happening today? And I want to read that and let you respond to that. In addition to something we need to explore more on what you're talking about. So I've
Yeah.
been reading Jared Diamond's Upheaval, where he describes the biggest problem facing the US is the dramatic collapse of political compromise.
Hmm.
You referred to it when you talked about the cultural polarization also. So, and we see this dramatic collapse of political compromise even in India, where you have two extremes.
Yeah.
And you've also talked about government failure, polarization. Can we? Can you tell us a bit more about to help us understand what's happening in the two largest democracies in the world?
Yeah, I think, well, first to that question, I am glad the person raised it because I've, in fact, I wanted to mention this. And there was a op-ed piece published last week by one of my favorite columnists in the New York Times, Ross Douthat. And he talks about the possibility of a breakup of the Republican Party and the possible transition into a multi-party system. I think that'll be a serious setback for the U.S. Polity, and I think that should be that I think we should pay attention to that. But let me come back to your question now. I think I believe Jared Diamond is correct. We should try and understand the significance of political compromise within the American system. And here I think the idea of American exceptionalism is useful. As you know, many US allies are interpreting, and many commentators in India as well are interpreting the Jan 6th events as the end of American exceptionalism. I have a different view on this. The Jan 6th events, I think, have in fact very effectively revealed the nature of American exceptionalism, which is the particular idea of political compromise that think is embedded in its constitution. And I think if you want to understand this, we all need to go back and read the 1651 treatise on the state and Leviathan by Thomas Hobbes. Um, Let me try and explain why Hobbes' view is important here. Um, so it helps us understand American exceptionalism in terms of its constitution, the US Constitution. And I think my fear is that these two factors, the government failure and polarization, may be leading to a constitutional crisis of sorts for the US. Now, if you think of the Hobbesian view and try and understand the US Constitution, the US founders, I think, did take the Hobbesian view to heart when thinking about the role of the Constitution. So, if you recall, in Hobbes, life in the jungle is nasty, brutish, and short. Now, what this means is not simply that the jungle represents anarchy or the absence of law. It also means that any law that emerges out of the jungle is based on the recognition that we've got a jungle that has varied interests and passions. We've got snakes, we've got rabbits, we've got deer, hyenas, tigers, elephants, and so on. And these are varied interests that whose nature are not going to be that will not be easily changed, but that uh, these varied individuals or animals with different interests and passions may come to agree to sort of live and let live in exchange for public goods that can be provided if there is a formation of a government. And to the extent that this compact with the original jungle of interest, so to speak, is maintained, the government or the Leviathan, in Hobbes' view, needs to be constrained with the help of a constitution. Now, such a compact, I think, holds if you focus on the provision of goods and not try to force convert the Hobbesian jungle into a garden in paradise. Right? And government failures and cultural wars um, and especially cultural wars based on forced conversion will weakens, I think, the ability of the US polity to meet these two exceptional requirements. And so when these requirements are violated, which I think there have been sort of at a slow bubble over time, that political compromise gets threatened. And that's what we are seeing. And I think it's a useful way to try and explain the rise of Trump. And if you try and explain both the 2016 and 2020 elections, a large section of the US population that ended up voting for Trump in these elections have felt politically disenfranchised as they see that the state has overextended itself. The Leviathan has grown much larger than what uh, was in the original compact, while failing at the same time to provide its most basic goods. And the most basic good here is widespread economic growth and prosperity. Another large section of the US population feels alienated from the cultural elite discourse that they see dominant in my own uh, academia here, in the federal bureaucracy, at the schools, and especially in the mainstream media, and of course in Hollywood as well. So there is this alienation from this cultural discourse that is going on. Trump, by the way, also managed to swing a large number of votes from the immigrant minority communities who come to the US with a single minded focus on improving their economic lives and don't empathize much with the cultural issues. Um, So if you take this Hobson view seriously and try and go back to last week's events, I think there's both good news and there's bad news. So first, the bad news. I think in the insurrection that happened last week, we had a glimpse of what the Hobson jungle really looks like, and it may end up permanently weakening the U.S. government structures. And that's where the Ross Douthat column on the split of the Republican Party becomes relevant. If it does indeed happen and it ends, if we end up with a breakup of the two-party system. Now, the good news is the U.S. constitutional setup seems to have managed these conflicts of the last year remarkably well under the so-called what I call the Trump stress. Consider what actually happened in these last few months. The courts, including the Supreme Court, rejected almost all of the 50 lawsuits brought by Trump, and not even the Trump appointed justices went along with Trump's claim of election fraud and denying Biden the election victory. The electoral college system too worked exceptionally well. It worked to protect the Biden win just as it had been intended. The electoral system disperses power to different state electors rather than concentrating it in the hands of a federal agency, which is what would have happened if we had switched from the electoral college vote system to a national vote. Um, so I think the U.S. Constitution and the basic fundamentals of the U.S. polity have withstood this Trump attack. So I think that's heartening. Um, Finally, on the India question, is India going through a similar experience? And my answer has to be twofold. That yes, in fact, we've been going through a far longer period of an overextended state that has weakened the capacity to govern, which is also why PM Modi's original election campaign promise of minimum government and maximum governance proved to be such an attractive one. Right? Um, and two, yes, we are also experiencing a nasty cultural war that has been built over a very long time, and it may get worse before it gets better. Let's hope um, the government is able to manage this while staying focused on what is really needed.
Well, Nimai, you've talked a lot about a few things which we will, over the next half an hour, explore more about people feeling alienated from the cultural discourse, about the failure of governments to deliver economic growth, and also when you talked about in India about the overreaching role of the government. What many people over here may not know is that Nimai's father was a gentleman called Madhu Mehta, who possibly introduced the concept of more economic freedom in our lives way back when I was a college student nearly 40 years ago. And he was the last general secretary of the Swatantra Party. So let's look now at what the Biden election and the Biden government, the implications of what's going to happen, especially with the Democrats controlling Congress and the Senate. And
Yeah.
maybe we could look at certain areas of where we could see changes happening, or maybe more of the same. Let's look at the relationship with India. So the Prime Minister Modi and his supporters have made heavy investments on Trump and building up that relationship. How will the new administration look at India? We've got a vice president who everyone's been touting has got, Indian ancestry. Will it be relatively lukewarm like earlier democratic administrations? What will be the impact of the relationship to China on the US relationships with India? Why don't
Yeah.
we talk? Let's start talking about that first.
Yeah, I think, well, let me start by, but as I was preparing for this talk, just a few days back, I've come across an interesting find from the White House website, and I'm not quite sure how to explain it, but on January 5th, Robert O'Brien, who is the US National Security Advisor in the Trump White House, declassified and released this overarching US strategic report on the Indo-Pacific. It's called US Strategic Framework for the Indo-Pacific, which spells out in detail the Trump administration's hopes for Indian leadership within the Indo-Pacific in light of China's increasingly aggressive behavior both at our borders and in the region. And if you go through, if you and I'm happy to share the document with you. And if you go through it, the policy objective stated in the report in that framework is to provide India with all the support needed to strengthen India's defense, intelligence gathering capacities, and at the same time support its efforts to reform and grow its economy. Now, the view in terms of what the switch to the Biden administration means. So, the view so far has been that the Biden administration will want to continue an active engagement with India. But I think there's, if again applying these two lenses of government failure and cultural polarization, I think we can draw a few lessons and apply them to this question about what the Biden administration means. And well, the Biden Kamala Harris administration. So, one, consider that the progression of government failure is accompanied by greater inertia. And this inertia is seen both at the executive level, the legislative branches, and more importantly, also in the bureaucracy. And this inertia opens up a gap, I find, between written policy statements and laws, the legislation that is passed by the US Congress, versus the actual observed changes on ground. So there's inertia, but there's also a lot of complexity that has built up over the years with an overextended state. So it's very difficult to get things actually moving, and this gap opens up. So I think I would like to see to what extent and what parts of the O'Brien strategic framework managed to be implemented, and how far did it move away from what the previous Obama um, administration had managed to achieve with respect to India. Because if we account for this bureaucratic and executive inertia, the changeover to the Biden administration may not be that significant in terms of what we should have expected under a Trump administration. Now, there is this question also of executive inertia with the change in the administration with the Biden election. I was looking at all of the appointments that Biden has made across his cabinet, and by my count, at least 9 out of 10 appointees that the Biden administration has managed to make are of people who had worked with him during the Obama administration. So there's a lot of the Obama administration personnel, so to speak, that are being brought into the current into the Biden administration and will shape policy going forward. Of course, the context are we've gone through a dramatic 4 years, and the context has changed. So we'll have to sort of see how this plays out. But beyond the inertia problem, it is also likely, I think, that the Biden, while being supportive of India's role in the Indo-Pacific, may in some way want to show some change from the Trump hardline view on China. That comes out very clearly in the strategic report, which indirectly may impact this administration's focus on India. Um, Biden, however, is also likely to roll back some of the arbitrary, I think, protectionist trade measures that were put in place by Trump. And I think if he does that, I think this would be in India's interest, as normalization of trade will help with economic recovery overall. Two, if one brings in the potential impact of Vice President Harris, I suspect a lot of this depends on how she sort of shapes her own role within the Biden administration. And this is where the US cultural polarization is likely to impact India. So the best hope, in my view, is that Harris operates more like Pence, that is more in the background and away from the stage lights. The problem, however, is that she may be expected to satisfy the more center-left perspectives in the Biden administration, and these are the perspectives that are also more invested in the cultural issues. So whether it's on human rights or labor standards, the environment, and so on. Um, I also looked at um, the change, the two appointees that are of direct relevance in the context of how this strategic framework report is going to be um, translated in the Biden administration. Um, the National Security Advisor is an old Biden hand. He's very well known, Jake Sullivan. He was instrumental both on the Iran policy deal under the Obama administration. And he does think um, that China is a serious problem at this point. Um, the the from what I can gather from the little I've read about his views is that there is a different perspective that he's bringing in on China. He recognizes China as a problem in the region, but at the same time, I think he seems to want to engage um, China rather than simply contain it. The strategic framework under the Trump administration seems to be heavily on containment and with some acknowledgement that China needs to be engaged. And I think that's going to change the way India gets the US-India relationships. The other person that's been brought in is the Secretary of State, also an old Obama hand, Anthony Blinken. He was the one who was very hawkish both on Syria and Libya. And during the campaign, the Biden campaign, 2020 campaign, he has expressed strong reservations both on Kashmir and on the Citizenship Act. So I think these are going to be important. Um, but I think the Harris effect sort of also depends on the cultural polarization we are seeing in India. And to the extent that the BJP manages um, or rather fails to manage the polarization in India, that's going to make us more vulnerable to whatever negative impact or that may happen with the switch to the Biden administration. On the other hand, if we manage to push through reforms in a sustained and strong manner, we can create conditions that would make us far less vulnerable to any negative impact of having a Biden administration to work with. And this sort of brings me to one final point. I think if you take this both the government failure and cultural polarization problems seriously, I think there's a limit to which we can really manage this. I mean, India can manage both navigating its relationship both with respect to government failure and polarization on both sides, right? We have this phenomena occurring on both sides. I think the greater hope lies in engaging far more aggressively with the private sector. And I think if you sort of um, see the emergence of the new private sector, especially in the tech industry, but across in the STEM industries. I think if we do this successfully, it holds a lot of promise in terms of achieving our own goals for greater productivity and economic growth. Um, if you sort of and put it in the Chinese context, you may have heard the news that Brazil has found that the Chinese vaccine is showing only 50% effectiveness. So I think the US and the technology sector and the private sector in the US and in the West is still maintaining and will maintain a lead over China, and that's where we need to engage and sort of reduce our dependence on managing this complex relationship with the public, with government, with the U.S. government.
Nimai, you've talked a lot about the cultural wars and the aspects of that, and also what's happening uh, with the access, with what's happening on campuses. Shall we
Yeah.
move to the education space?
Mhm.
And what changes do you see, or how do you see this playing out in the world that you are in academia, on the impact on education, and also maybe tie it in with, given the fact that there's a lot of people over here interested in what's to understand more about immigration. So I'm going to sort of combine two topics over here. One is the cultural war impact on education, and also what do you see happening with the Biden government on immigration.
So let me pick on the immigration and India interests here. I think we should start. Um, we need to sort of graduate beyond this need to petition for greater H-1B visas for our STEM graduates. I think we need more aggressively to attract investment within the country, and especially investment in the education sector that can upgrade the skills across both basic education, STEM education, and higher education in India, um, and attract investment by tech companies that would employ our STEM graduates within India. So I think from the Indian perspective, I think that's how I would like to see things develop. This move away from trying to hoping for greater opening for H-1B visas and other forms of labor export, and more investment in our own um, education and skill infrastructure, and of course in the job market itself. As far as education in the US is concerned, I think it's a problem. I think the higher education is also having its own crisis. Increasingly, education outside of, especially outside of the STEM fields, is delivering a four-year education uh, product that is of diminishing value. It has resulted in large number of students building up student debt over time, that they are finding increasingly difficult to pay back, because the skills that we give them in the four-year education program um, seem not to be well matched with the actual requirements of a rapidly changing job market. And I think that's one thing I was encouraged seeing Trump take a move I think in a correct direction there, and that was to, in the higher education sector, in terms of employability. If you recall, Ivanka Trump made this initiative of, at least in the federal government, to get rid of the requirements of a four-year college degree as a pathway to segue to federal employment. Um, I think there are many alternative forms of skill acquisition that have emerged, both online and in person in smaller professional colleges, that can fulfill these more specialized skill requirements. And I think U.S. education it's going through an important period of uh, transition. Um, so in terms of, I'm not sure what else you would like me to touch on, but the Trump, as far as basic education is concerned, there were some important changes that the Trump administration brought in. I would say the most important one being the support for charter schools. Um, Given the performance of the public schools here, and school choice. And I think Parth Shah, who I hope has been able to join in, would have observed that. Um, I think it is a problem that the Biden administration seems to move away from that. Um, so we'll have to sort of see how that plays out in the education sector.
So if you look at some of the things that, and maybe we'll come back to it later, about what's the legacy of Trump, because a lot of policies that he came up with actually make a lot of economic sense and free markets, etc. But I'm just looking at some of the questions being asked,
Yeah.
and Parth is Parth, by the way, just said he is on this call.
Yeah,
So
I see that.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And so there's a few questions coming out. Actually, one from your student, and it's tied
Oh,
up with some of the other questions.
okay.
Chinmay from last year
Oh,
said,
yeah.
SPP said, will the U.S. intervention in other countries stop or get reduced because of the need to course correct in their own country? And a couple of other questions which have come up is what's the role what's the Biden strategy going to be towards Pakistan? And someone else asked the question of what's the Biden strategy going to be on the Middle East, because Trump has focused a lot on the Middle East.
Yeah. Um, so on the question of Chinmay's question about US interventionism, I think that was, um, if you sort of think of how to assess the Trump record, I see his Trump record, I sort of contrast it with the consensus forecast that was made, that came together when Trump was elected, about what was expected of the Trump administration. And if you just use that as the benchmark, then I think Trump has done remarkably well, simply in terms of, well, we have to qualify that with the events of last week. But in terms of what was expected, he did remarkably well, because we didn't go into a depression, we didn't go into a third world war, and so on. He did manage to sustain the economic recovery that was already underway, with the sort of with the influence of the 2008 financial crisis, ebbing of that. Um, I think he did a few things that were important. He but again, I think the one has to balance out with the problem with the Trump administration is that he was not the person who would have been able um, to change the direction of the long-term government failure that I've been talking about. I think his focus was excessively on the cultural polarization, which got much worse under the Trump administration. But he did do a few things. Like I would point to the to making the U.S. corporate tax rate more competitive. That brought back both U.S. company investments. um, he did um, he did deregulate in a couple of sectors, but not as much as he or his administration had initially uh, planned to. I think the tragedy of the Trump administration was that, again, he seems not to have been taken any serious interest in these underlying uh, problems. And there was this continuous non-stop polarized um, polarization that went on starting in 2017 with the initiation of the special counsel Robert Mueller's investigation into Russian interference that went on from 2017 to 2020. Well, I'm sorry, 2019 spring, the Mueller report came out and acquitted Trump of the conspiracy charges. And then soon after, by September of 2019, the US Congress brought in the articles of impeachment on the Ukrainian attempts to influence, pressure Ukraine to help Trump with the 2020 election campaign. And that went on um, till February or March of 2020. And in the meantime, the pandemic was inside the US. So I think a lot of the Trump administration 4 years have been wasted in terms of what was possible and what needed to be done.
Pakistan and the Middle East.
But I think okay. So the Middle East, the recognition of Israel and the willingness to work with Israel, both by the UAE and Bahrain, and then Sudan, I think would be considered as an important um, sort of reconfiguration of the Middle East politics. Um, I think the Palestinian problem still exists, and I'm not quite sure. I think the switch to the Biden administration, the attention will be turned uh, to that. But Trump has managed to change the dynamics of the Middle East, also because the Middle East itself is recognizing that the future does not lie with the with these heavy oil dependent based economies. The other foreign policy thing that I was interested in, and I should not have expected much to come out of it, but I think it was an um, important attempt to reach out to North Korea and try to appeal to North Korea's economic interests. I think that was, well, for the lack of a better term, that was a brave move on part of Trump to try and shake up that relationship. Of course, didn't go anywhere. On Pakistan, um, I'm not quite sure what the Biden administration. Well, for the Trump administration, the fact that the Trump administration has been determined to withdraw troops from Afghanistan, I think that has an important impact on Pakistan and India's relationship with Pakistan. Um, yeah, I won't have many. I
Okay.
don't have too many insights on Pakistan at
Let,
this
let's move
point.
let's move on to explore another thing which you talked about, which distracted Trump's administration a lot in the last 1 year, which was COVID and the whole
Correct.
implication of that. Going forward, what do you see Biden's strategy both on COVID, which is immediate one, and public health, which is a larger issue also along with that?
Yeah, so I think, well, on the immediate one, I would, and I should have remembered to mention Operation Warp Speed, which I think was the single greatest accomplishment of the Trump administration to put that together. Um, I do think that the polarization did impact the way that has worked out. Um, the in terms of what we have seen here is again government failure impacting the both the ability of the federal government agencies and the state agencies to respond to the pandemic. I think it's remarkable if you look at how the FDA has timed itself on these clinical trials, and it's a symptom of this bureaucratic inertia and the safety first focus on safety first that has um, that has sort of impacted both how quickly these vaccines were brought out, um, and the distribution of vaccines now. And the distribution, of course, depends on a lot on the state local capacity, and that also seems to be a problem. The Biden administration has promised to um, funnel more funds as part of this. I think this latest stimulus bill that he has announced towards the state local authorities to give them increase their capacity to go through a quicker rollout of the vaccine. Um, he's promised the 1,400 additional stimulus fund dollars. I think a lot of that should have been focused on directed towards increasing the capacity of the U.S. Um, to distribute these vaccines and manufacturing capacity of other vaccines that are coming are in the pipeline.
We've got about 10 minutes left, Nimai. Maybe we
Yeah,
sort of jump to some of the questions which are out over there.
yeah,
If you
definitely.
also have access on that, if there's something that you'd like to address, you could
This is in the chat.
in the Q&A.
Oh, Q&A. Okay.
There's one question in the chat
Yeah,
which has not yet been moved to Q&A, but I'm happy to read that out for you if
That's
you want.
sure.
Barron's. That's Barron's one. Yep. Go
Yeah,
ahead.
yeah. So the question is, It starts with a statement: the institutional capacity in the US to face up to the cultural polarization and government failures have so far withstood the social and political tensions. The electoral college system worked in 2016 and later in 2020, and the judiciary too clearly played its part in 2000 and even more so last year. The question then: are these adequate insurance policies for the US in the years to come if the cultural divisions deepen?
If the cultural divisions what?
Deepen.
Oh,
Deepen,
deepen.
deepen.
Yeah, yeah. Um, well, I think, as I mentioned, I think if both the cultural polarization deepens and um, the and the government failure, the progress of government failure is not reversed, I think that does pose a problem. Um, but at the same time, just as I've thought about the Indian case and Indian interests, there is and the vaccine, the remarkable quick turnaround of the development of these different vaccines, um, I think has created a space of hope here in terms of what these new technologies are promising. There have been a number of technological breakthroughs over the past few years, and those seem to, especially in the US, seem to be gathering steam. So I think we are going through seem to be going through a transition period where, on one hand, we are still having to deal with government failure and cultural polarization, um, but on the other hand, um, the private sector, the IT sector, the STEM fields, basic research and development seem to be surging ahead. So some sort of so there are there is both the optimism on future growth and productivity, and a caution on the basic polity and institutions of governance in the US.
Okay. Uh, Nimai, do you want to sort of look at some of the questions in the
Yeah,
Q&A box?
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Um,
So there's one from Vijay Deshmukh. Um,
yeah.
we'll be able to reverse the culture of biased local administration delaying or Louis, do you say you would want to answer
No,
this?
no, no. Go, no, go ahead. Go ahead.
Ah, okay. Delaying or ignoring warnings which are politically inconvenient. Um, well, what I'd like to ask Mr. Deshmukh, if does he have any particular example in mind? Um, I think the cultural, both the cultural polarization and the weakening of local government capacity will delay this, will keep weakening the ability of the local administrations to respond to warnings, and polarization does make this more difficult. So that's sort of a more of a general response here. Um,
There's a
Yeah,
question.
so on the anonymous attendee, I think that's correct. I think one of the things we should also pay attention to is how um, China is observing and interpreting these events. In fact, if you look at the editorials in the Global Times in Beijing, they have on one hand pulled up Nancy Pelosi for what they call her hypocrisy on criticizing the Hong Kong protesters, and on the other hand, they have pointed to the Twitter ban and claim that this is again reveals the U.S. hypocrisy about free speech. They are also the more extremists, the extreme, not just domestic terrorists, but the terrorists out there, Al Qaeda, remnants of ISIS that are going to be impressed by what happened last week. Um, so I think either from a different planet or more relevant for us, how is China going to be viewing this? the during the Trump administration, the other interesting development in terms of how China is viewing this is to see how the Chinese are viewing this. And what you find is on the progressive Chinese side, they have all been very strong Trump supporters because they do support Trump's taking this tough stand against China. There's a question from Madhukar Kotwal on Quad and Blue Dot network policies. I'm sorry, I'm not. I don't have information on that, and I'm not. Yeah, I just don't have sufficient knowledge about those two policies. Um, yeah, so the U.S. media is part of has become part of this. The mainstream media in the U.S. has become part of this problem of cultural polarization. How do I differentiate the two? I think if I had to focus on the Indian media, I think I would focus on just improving the quality of journalism and journalism education and writing in the Indian media. I am far more optimistic about the Indian media. I think, in spite of what is today being talked about to some extent the sycophancy in the Indian media. I think the Indian media space is far more vibrant, and there are multiple publications, online publications that have come online, and I think in the developments I'm seeing in the Indian media are quite progressive and hopeful. So I'm not too concerned about the Indian media at this point. Um, I'm just seeing if there's anything that has not been touched on that I could.
So maybe we have, Nima, if I could jump to as the last sort of thing we can talk about is
Yeah,
the role of government in our lives. You mentioned it, how Trump sort of some ways got away from it. We've had in India the more governance, less government, and things like that happening,
yeah.
and the renewed romance amongst youngsters about socialism. What do you see going forward based on that?
The romance about socialism. Well, with the young, there's always the romance about justice and equity and so on. I think that could be should be leveraged for positive in a positive way. Um, I think going forward, well, I would just say. I know Dr. Kelkar and Ajay Shah are expected to speak next week, I believe, next Friday at the George Washington University webinar, and they're going to talk about economic reforms. And I had got the announcement, and one of the things I saw they were going to speak about is the relationship between the state and individuals. So I would point all of us to that webinar. I think that's going to be a webinar worth attending.
I think we've run out of time.
Yeah, yeah.
Shilpa, could we hand it over
Yeah.
to you? Thank you, Nimai, for a very interesting conversation.
Oh,
Yes.
thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Mehta. Thank you very much, Mr. Miranda, for chairing the event. And, it's been such an interactive, a timely, and a very informative discussion. You've provided us with an evening of so many perspectives and takeaways, and I want to thank you both for engaging with us. I think your conversation presented a new dimension to the many critical challenges and realities of present day USA. There are many reverberations and reactions from around the world. So, thank you once again.
Thank
Uh,
you, Shilpa. Thank you
yeah.
for putting this
Thank you.
together.
I
And
wanted
go,
to thank our PIC colleagues for their tremendous efforts behind the scenes. It's been a very hectic start to the year for them, and they've been there and they're always there all the time. So thank you very much. And last but certainly not the least, many thanks to all members of the audience for your enthusiastic and positive participation. We know it's a Friday evening. Thank you for sharing your hour with us. We hope you and many others will join future PIC events as well. Please stay tuned for updates on our website and social media pages. Professor Mehta, Mr. Miranda, we look forward to hosting you once again. Thank you
Thank
very
you.
much.
thank
Yeah,
you.
We've reached the end
thank
of
you.
this